外一位嘅講者啦，咁就係猶太教嘅朋友Jordan，佐敦布達殊博士。咁猶太教咧係一個非常之有歷史嘅宗教啦，咁可能因為咁有歷史啦，通常有歷史就覺得係好傳統好古老等等咁樣。究竟又係唔係咁嘅咧？咁特別即係有關性嘅議題，有關同志，咁第一扮過嚟就話哇影響個家庭嘅完整喎，咁樣成個家庭嘅倫理俾你搞禍啦咁。咁喺一個咁傳統，亦都係有咁耐歷史嘅猶太教裏邊，佢又點樣理解家庭咧？佢嘅家庭觀係點嘅咧？同個創造有咩關係咧？咁樣。咁現在咧，我就邀請阿 Jordan 出嚟同我哋分享。咁喺呢度咧，就因為 Jordan 咧就係用英語嚟到係去分享㗎。如果在座邊位係需要翻譯嘅，請你哋舉手，咁我哋就可以俾啲headphone 你哋 headset 舉定啲，咁我哋啲同事可以。唔該晒。
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes? Great. I'll wait for everyone to look up. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You know, in religion, there's so much debate about the place of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. And so often that debate focuses around why are people lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender? And personally, I find that question a bit absurd. I think we'll never know the answer to it. And so I was so pleased to be invited today to talk not about why do people exist, but the much more interesting question of how do we include everybody in religious and spiritual life. And I want to say that in Judaism, we are a very diverse religion, like most religions. And we have people who believe all sorts of things with a common foundation. We have people who are fundamental and who are orthodox, and we have people who are liberal and progressive. And many of the views that I will share with you this afternoon come from the more progressive and liberal side. However, I'm going to use teachings and texts that are common to all Jews. So maybe it gives us a clue as about a way that we can all move forward on inclusion. Now, whenever I'm asked to talk about the place of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people in Judaism, one of the first things that gets pointed out are two verses in the book of Leviticus. The first verse says, "Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination." And the second verse comes 2 chapters later that says that the punishment for this act, this is the act of male homosexual relationships, is death. Now it's important to know that the way that Judaism is practiced today, in the same way that it has been practiced for over 2,000 years, is not according to exactly what we call the Torah, or other people call the Bible or the Old Testament, says. We don't practice exactly what the Bible says, because for over 2,000 years, our tradition has been based on the interpretation of this sacred text. So even way back in time, somewhere around the year 200, the Common Era, soon after our large temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, the rabbis back then had to figure out how to make Judaism relevant for the people living at that time. So here's a couple of examples of what they did. First, we were all supposed to go pray at this temple, and now this temple was gone. Not only that, the Jews were removed from the land of Israel. So the rabbi said it was acceptable to pray somewhere else, to pray in your local house of worship, or what we call a synagogue. And when this temple was destroyed, we could no longer go with all of the commandments in the book of Leviticus, telling us to sacrifice different animals at different times. And it was determined about 2,000 years ago that we could replace animal sacrifice with spoken prayer. These were creative interpretations that seemed to violate basic teachings in the Torah. But they're creative interpretations that allow the religion to continue to flourish and to be relevant. There's another verse in the Bible that's often pointed to, and that says that if you cause harm to somebody and you cause them to lose an eye, then it's eye for an eye, limb for a limb, tooth for tooth. And it sounds pretty brutal, that if you harm someone intentionally or unintentionally, and they lose an eye, that you will have to lose your eye in return. But, over 2,000 years ago, the rabbi said this is not what this verse means. It was a metaphor for equal compensation. So what we see is a tradition that for a very long time now has taken some of the most problematic parts of the tradition, particularly those that are about harm or causing discrimination, and finding ways to still make it relevant for us. And in our modern times, an American rabbi named Stephen Greenberg, who's an Orthodox rabbi, so from a more fundamental side, but who's also a gay man, has found all sorts of ways in which to understand the teachings from Leviticus that seem to separate out lesbians, gays, bisexual, and transgender people. He says that people often say the reason these prohibitions exist is because of the need for reproduction, but then he says within Judaism there's a long history of having sex just for enjoyment, and also that the basic commandment to be fruitful and multiply is really about maintaining the world so it keeps going on. That concerns that men will just up and leave their wives if they're allowed to engage in homosexual relations wouldn't happen if we didn't force people into roles that they could not fulfill. And we have other teachings about that, about not putting stumbling blocks before people who cannot see, or cursing those who cannot hear, because you're putting them in a situation in which they cannot succeed. People's worry about things becoming confused or blurry because of the change in gender relations that it means if you engage in same-sex behaviors. He points out that we have actual blessings that we say when we see something that's unique or we see something that's different. And that we have a long history of tradition that things were created that have miraculous powers when they're created during blurry times, when it's not quite day and not quite night. And lastly, that almost every example of a homosexual act in the Bible is in relationship to rape, humiliation, or shame. And said that there was no idea that two consenting adults could be involved in an equal and loving relationship. And so, in short, the Judaism that we practice, that we know today, is not the Judaism in the Bible. It's something else. So what is it? Well, on the question of inclusion, I think it's obvious to us that inclusion is a big part of what we do. And I'll give you two examples. This past week, Jews all over the world celebrated a pretty important holiday. And it's a holiday called Shavuot. And it commemorates the end of the wheat harvest in Israel. But it also commemorates the giving of Torah, the giving of the Ten Commandments and the Bible to Moses at Mount Sinai. And what we do during this holiday is we read a book from the Bible called the Book of Ruth. So for those of you who are not familiar, let me give you a quick rundown of Ruth. At a time of famine in the land of Judea, a family decided to leave Israel and go to the land of Moab. And this family consisted of a husband and wife, Elimelech and Naomi, and their 2 sons. And while they were in Moab, the 2 sons married 2 local Moabite women. But later on, because of the famine, the husband and the 2 sons died. So Naomi decides she's going to go back to her land, to Judea, to Israel. And she says to her daughter-in-law, stay here. You're young, you can find new husbands, stay. And one of them does stay, and one does not. The one named Ruth goes with her. And she goes and she takes care of her mother-in-law, and she ends up gleaning in a field to collect the wheat, and it ends up being the field of one of Naomi's husband's relatives. And Boaz and Ruth fall in love, and they end up getting married, and their great-grandson ends up being King David, one of our greatest kings. Now what's extraordinary about this story is that in Deuteronomy it says very clearly that Jews are not allowed to marry Moabites. And this is pretty strict, because even though we say we were enslaved by Egyptians, we're told that after 3 generations, a Jew could marry an Egyptian, but could never, ever marry a Moabite. And yet we have a story of not only a Jew who marries a Moabite, but that person ends up being the great-grandmother of one of our greatest kings. And so here, even within the Torah itself, we see a contradiction. And it said that the reason Boaz was allowed to marry Ruth is because of another teaching that says that if a man dies without children, his closest male relative should marry him so that his family line can continue. And so that was more important than this prohibition against Moabites. In another part of the Bible, we're told in the very beginning, creation, pru or vu, be fruitful and multiply. All the species of the earth are supposed to be fruitful and multiply. But in the prophet Isaiah, we're told about temple eunuchs, which were men who served in the temple, not eunuchs in the sense that they were castrated or damaged in any way, but men who served in the temple and didn't have children. And prophet Isaiah teaches that even though they don't have children, they are guaranteed their names to last forever, and that God will remember them and include them in the community. And that same exact verse says the same thing for strangers, non-Jews who come into the Jewish community. So what we see in these teachings are ways to bring about inclusion, even when major prohibitions happen. Because we are a religion of interpretation. And when we want to include someone, we can. Now, all of these interpretations, if you listen carefully, don't violate the original. They just sort of change it a little bit. And so what is the highest principle then in our religion? There is a story in the Talmud about a man who really doubted religion, didn't believe in any of it, thought it was absurd, and he decided he was going to go to the 2 greatest teachers at the time and see if he could make them upset. So this man first goes to Rabbi Shammai, and he says, "Oh, great Rabbi Shammai, teach me the entire Torah as I stand on 1 foot." Well, the rabbi was completely insulted by this, because how could you learn the whole Torah while maintaining your balance on 1 foot? And he sent the man away in anger. "How dare you insult me this way?" And of course, this is what the man wanted. So then the man goes to the other greatest rabbi of the time, Rabbi Hillel the Elder, and he says, "Rabbi Hillel, teach me the entire Torah as I stand on 1 foot." And Rabbi Hillel looks at the man and says, "Do not do unto others as you would not have them do unto you. The rest of the Torah is commentary. Now go and study." It is quite clear that Rabbi Hillel's teaching actually comes from a verse almost directly in the middle of the Torah, in between the prohibition against male homosexuality and the punishment, chapter 18 and then later chapter 20, 21. In the middle of that is a verse that says, "Love your neighbor as yourself. I am God." Because what we know in Judaism, what we believe, is that no matter what, we were created B'Tselem Elohim. We were created in the image of God. And that the best we can do to live that out is to treat each other the way that we want to be treated. To not treat each other the way we do not want to be treated. And to find the ways to bring each other into relationship. None of us will ever know the mind of God. There are people who run around saying they know what God wants, but none of us know. In Judaism, we would consider that idolatry to believe that we know what's really in the mind of God. But if we were created in the image of God, if the central teaching is treat your neighbor the way that you would want to be treated, and do not do unto others what is hateful to you, then that's the closest we can get to living out God's work on this earth. And the most that we can do to be God's partners in creation as we move forward. So, what is the essence? Treat each other the way you want to be treated. Love your neighbor as yourself. And now that we have that foundation, creatively figure out how to go and study and bring that about. Close with one verse from the book of Numbers. An incident of a prophet from Moab who is hired to curse the Israelites. But upon looking out at the way that they had created their community and set up their tents, instead of a curse, what comes out of his mouth in English is this. "Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brothers and sisters to dwell together in unity." And in Hebrew, what we say, "Hine ma tovu ma na'im, shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tovu ma na'im, shevet achiot gam yachad. Hine ma tov, yadadai, yadadadadadadai. Hine ma tov, yadadai, yadadadadadadai. Hine ma tovu ma na'im, shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tovu ma na'im, shevet achiot gam yachad." Look how good and pleasant it is when brothers and sisters dwell in unity. Thank you.
Jordan, thank you so much, Jordan. He is not only a very good speaker, a very good singer. 係好叻咁，即係嗰個分享好豐富，亦都係歌聲好甜蜜。弟兄姊妹和睦同居，是何等的美，是何等的善。咁好多謝阿 Jordan 咧，帶出一個喺猶太教裏邊一個咁重要嘅精神，咁重要嘅一個信仰實踐，一個 Golden Rule 金科玉律。你想人哋點待你，你就點待人。己所不欲，勿施於人。同埋喺基督教裏邊，我哋成日講最大誡命， 愛盡心盡性盡意愛主我哋嘅上帝，其次係愛鄰舍如同自己。呢一個最大嘅誡命係源自於猶太教。咁猶太教喺好多嘅反同志、反性小眾咧，成日都係 call 利未記啊，即係舊約一啲嘅經文啦咁樣。咁今日 Jordan 都俾到我哋一個嘅理解同埋一個角度咧，就係、其實好多嘅拉比咧，都係對於佢哋嘅 Torah 古代嘅經文咧，係存在嗰個詮釋，而呢個詮釋係點樣係同今日我哋生活人類嘅處境係對老還嘅咁啊。